dust of the Wyoming Territory settles on everything, including a man's soul. For Josiah Coulter, a trapper seeking solitude, peace was a fragile thing. One morning, the glint of something broken on the trail catches his eye. Not rock, not bone, but the snapped quill of a sacred eagle feather. It's a sign of a fallen warrior. Following a trail of blood no bigger than a dropped coin, he finds a Cheyenne man clinging to life. But back in town, a posse is forming, thirsty for vengeance. Josiah has a choice: turn his back or risk everything for a stranger. The sun was a merciless hammer over the Bighorn Basin, beating the scent of sage and dry earth out of the ground. Josiah Coulter moved with the practiced economy of a man who understood that wasted effort was a debt paid in sweat and fatigue. His buckskin shirt, worn soft as a second skin, was dark with perspiration under the pack straps. He wasn't checking his trap lines. It was too late in the season. He was hunting, seeking the quiet communion that came only from tracking a ghost-like pronghorn through the draws and arroyos that spiderwebbed the foothills. It was the unnatural angle that caught his eye. Not the curve of a fallen branch or the jagged line of a rock, but a sharp, clean break. He crouched, his movements fluid, his gaze sweeping the ground before he focused on the object. Two feathers snapped at the quill. They were from the tail of a golden eagle, barred with dark brown and tipped in white, the kind of feathers earned through great courage, and not simply found. One was fletched with a tuft of red horsehair, bound by sinew. A warrior's adornment. They lay near a scuff mark in the hardpan dirt, a chaotic smear that spoke of a sudden, violent fall. Josiah's heart, usually a slow and steady drum, picked up its rhythm. This was trouble. Trouble had a scent, and it smelled a lot like this, the metallic tang of blood, hanging faintly in the hot, still air. His eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned the area with an intensity that missed nothing. He found it a few feet away, a dark, almost black spot on a flat stone no bigger than a silver dollar. It was still tacky. He followed the trail not with his feet, but with his eyes spotting another minuscule drop on a blade of buffalo grass, then another on the bark of a stunted juniper. The tracks were jumbled, the stride of the man who'd left them uneven and dragging. One boot print or moccasin, it was hard to tell, was firm, while the other was a long, deep gouge. A leg injury. A bad one. For a moment, Josiah considered turning back. His cabin, nestled in a stand of cottonwoods a few miles west, was a sanctuary he had built with his own hands. He had come to this land after the war, after seeing enough of man's capacity for brutality at places like Antietam and Gettysburg to last him 10 lifetimes. He had no quarrel with the Cheyenne or the Arapaho. He traded with them when they were willing, giving them space as they gave him the same. Getting involved in a lone warrior's fate was a fool's errand. It was an invitation for the world he'd fled to come crashing back down on him. But then he saw the feathers again. They weren't just decorations. They were a man's story, his honor. To leave them lying in the dust felt like a desecration. With a sigh that stirred the dust at his feet, he picked them up, his calloused fingers gentle, and tucked them into his shirt pocket. He adjusted the rifle in the crook of his arm and began to follow the trail. It led him half a mile into a maze of rust-colored hoodoos and rock formations that looked like melted candles. The heat was trapped here, shimmering off the stone walls. The trail grew clearer, the blood more frequent. The man was weakening and fast. Josiah rounded a massive boulder and stopped dead. There, slumped in the sliver of shade offered by an overhang, was the warrior. He was young, maybe 20 summers, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones, now pale under his bronze skin. His long black hair was matted with sweat and dirt. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, save for a simple necklace of bone and turquoise. His left leg was a mess. A crude tourniquet made from a strip of his own breechcloth was tied high on his thigh, but the leggings below it were soaked in a terrible dark red. A bullet wound by the looks of it. An old one, too. The flesh around it was swollen and angry. The warrior's eyes, black and deep-set, snapped open. They were hazed with pain and fever, but a spark of fierce defiance burned within them. His hand moved quick, as a snake to the knife sheathed at his belt. Josiah held up his free hand, palm open and slow. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not here to finish the job." The warrior said nothing. His knuckles were white on the hilt of his knife. His breathing was shallow, a ragged counterpoint to the buzz of a fly circling his wounded leg. "You're losing a lot of blood," Josiah continued, taking a careful step forward. "That wound's gone bad." The warrior shifted, trying to push himself up, and a wave of agony washed over his face. He hissed a word in the Cheyenne language, a curse directed either at Josiah or his own failing body. Josiah stopped. He wasn't a fool. He knew the reputation of the Cheyenne dog soldiers. He knew the tension simmering between the tribes and the settlers, fanned into flame by broken treaties and land-hungry prospectors. The man in front of him saw a white man with a rifle, and that meant only one thing: enemy. "My name is Josiah Coulter," he said, keeping his voice calm and even. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the 2 broken feathers. He held them out on his open palm. "I believe these belong to you." The warrior's gaze flickered from Josiah's face to the feathers. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps confusion, crossed his features. His grip on the knife loosened almost imperceptibly. He recognized the story they told, the honor they represented. For this white man to return them not as a trophy, but as a respectful gesture was something outside his experience. "You need water," Josiah stated, unhooking his canteen. He didn't move closer, just uncorked it and set it on the ground between them. "And that leg needs a doctor. Not that I am one. But I can clean it. It'll fester right through to the bone if you leave it." The sun beat down. The only sounds were the warrior's labored breathing and the ceaseless hum of insects. The warrior's eyes bored into Josiah, searching for a hint of deception, a sign of the trap he was sure was being laid. He saw only a quiet weariness in the man's gaze, a deep-seated gravity that was neither hostile nor friendly. It was simply present. Slowly, painfully, the warrior reached out a trembling hand, not for his knife, but for the canteen. His fingers closed around it, and he dragged it toward him. He watched Josiah the entire time, his pride warring with the desperate, burning thirst that cracked his lips. Josiah knew this was the first step on a dangerous path. Helping this man meant making an enemy of others. It meant inviting the very violence he'd sought to escape directly into his life. The posse that had surely shot this man would still be looking for him. But looking at the warrior, stripped of everything but his pain and his pride, Josiah didn't see a Cheyenne or an enemy. He saw a man clinging to the edge of life under a brutal Wyoming sun. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he could not walk away. The decision once made settled in Josiah's gut like a stone. He couldn't leave the warrior here. The sun would kill him if the infection didn't. He pointed back the way he came. "My cabin is a few miles from here. It's hidden. No one will find you there." The warrior, whose name Josiah would later learn, was Nakoa, only stared back, his black eyes clouded with fever and suspicion. He understood the words, but the intent was alien to him. Why would this man help? He gave a short, sharp shake of his head. He would not be taken. Josiah understood. To be a captive was a fate worse than death. "I'm not taking you prisoner," he said, trying to infuse his voice with sincerity. He gestured to the wounded leg. "You'll die here. If you come with me, you might live. It's your choice." He turned his back, a calculated risk, and walked a few paces away to his pack. He rummaged inside, pulling out a small canvas pouch of dried jerky and a roll of clean linen he used for cleaning his rifle. He set them on the ground next to the canteen. "There's food and bandages. I'll be back before sundown. If you're still here, I'll help. If you're gone, well, good luck to you." With that, he turned and walked away, not looking back. It was the only way. He had to give the man the illusion of choice to let him believe he was in control of his own fate. As Josiah walked, the memories came unbidden, as they always did in moments of moral crisis. He was back on the banks of a creek in Maryland, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and decay. He was a young man then, a corporal in the Union Army, barely old enough to grow a proper beard. After a skirmish, they'd found a Confederate boy in the woods, no older than 16, with a gut wound. His commanding officer, a bitter major named Hawthorne, had ordered them to leave him. "Waste of morphine," he'd spat. "He's rebel scum." Josiah had disobeyed. Under the cover of darkness, he'd snuck back with his canteen and a pouch of hardtack. He'd sat with the boy, given him water, and held his hand as his life slipped away. He hadn't saved him, but he had given him a measure of comfort in his final moments. Major Hawthorne had found out. Josiah spent 2 weeks in the stockade for it, but he never regretted it. That quiet act of defiance had preserved a small piece of his own soul in a war that was determined to grind it to dust. He was not going to let this be a repeat of that failure. This time he could do more. He returned as the sun began to bleed across the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. He approached the rock formation with caution, his rifle ready. The warrior could be gone, or he could be waiting in ambush. He was still there. He hadn't moved from the spot, but he had drunk most of the water and eaten a piece of the jerky. The empty canteen lay by his side. When he saw Josiah, he didn't reach for his knife. He just watched his expression unreadable. "Decided to stay then," Josiah said softly. "Good. We need to move. It'll be dark soon." Getting Nakoa to his feet was an ordeal. The pain from his leg was blinding, and every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through him. Josiah was strong, but Nakoa was a proud man, unwilling to show the full extent of his weakness. He leaned on Josiah, his arm draped over the trapper's broad shoulders, hissing through his teeth as they began the slow, torturous journey. The half-mile back to where Josiah had left his horse felt like 10. Nakoa spoke only once, a guttural command in his own tongue. Josiah didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear when Nakoa pointed to a game trail that was less direct but offered more cover. He was already thinking like a hunted man. Josiah nodded and followed his lead. By the time they reached Josiah's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Boulder, full darkness had fallen. Lifting Nakoa onto the saddle was another challenge that left both men gasping and sweating in the cool night air. Josiah led the horse, picking his way carefully through the familiar landscape, his senses on high alert for any sign they were being followed. Josiah's cabin was tucked into a narrow valley, shielded by a thick grove of aspens and a high rock wall. A creek gurgled nearby its sound, a constant soothing presence. He helped Nakoa down and half carried him inside. The cabin was a single room, impeccably clean and organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a bed built into the opposite corner. Shelves held neatly stacked tins of food books and jars of herbs. He laid Nakoa on his own bed, ignoring the warrior's grunt of protest. "Stay put," he commanded, lighting a kerosene lamp. The room filled with a warm yellow glow. Josiah went to work. He stoked the fire and put a pot of water on to boil. He laid out the linen bandages, a clean knife, and a bottle of whiskey. He looked at Nakoa, whose face was now slick with sweat, his eyes glazed over. "This is going to hurt," Josiah said, his voice grim. "Like hell." He held out the whiskey bottle. "Drink." Nakoa eyed the bottle with distrust, but took it. He took a long swallow, shuddering as the raw spirit burned its way down his throat. Josiah carefully cut away the torn and blood-caked leggings. The wound was worse than he'd thought. The bullet had gone clean through the thigh, but the flesh around the exit wound was puffy and discolored, streaked with angry red lines. The infection was deep. "I have to clean it out," Josiah said, more to himself than to Nakoa. He took the knife and held it in the fire until the blade glowed red. He poured some of the whiskey onto a rag. "Bite on this," he said, handing a strip of leather to Nakoa. Nakoa pushed it away, his jaw set. He would not show such weakness. He gripped the sides of the mattress, his knuckles turning white, and gave Josiah a single sharp nod. The next 10 minutes were a brutal eternity. Josiah worked with a grim focus, cleaning the wound with whiskey and hot water, his knife probing to ensure no part of the bullet or cloth had been left behind. Nakoa did not scream. A low, guttural groan was torn from his chest, and his body arched in agony, but he made no other sound. His eyes locked on Josiah's burned with an intensity that was part hatred, part pain, and part something else, a grudging respect. When it was over, Josiah packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey from one of his jars and bound it tightly with clean linen. Nakoa was limp, his skin clammy, his breathing shallow. The fever was raging. Josiah spent the rest of the night by the bedside, changing the cool cloths on Nakoa's forehead and forcing sips of willowbark tea, a natural fever reducer, between his lips. In his delirious state, Nakoa murmured in his own language, his words a torrent of memories and prayers. Josiah sat and listened, understanding nothing but the universal language of suffering. He felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. This was more than just a man with a bullet in his leg. This was a life he had bound to his own, a debt he had chosen to incur. Outside, the Wyoming night was silent and vast, but inside the small cabin, a fragile truce had been forged in pain and whiskey, a bond sealed by a debt of the soul. While Josiah Coulter fought to keep one life from flickering out in his secluded cabin, the town of Dust Devil Creek was busy stoking the flames of vengeance. The town was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the wilderness, a collection of false-fronted buildings that served the needs of the ranchers' prospectors and trappers who called the basin home. It had a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a livery, and the office of Sheriff Wallace Thorne. The news had arrived just after noon, brought by a terrified man on a lathered horse. His name was Silas Kane, a drifter who'd been working as a hired hand for the Ferguson family at their homestead 10 miles east of town. Kane had burst into the saloon, his eyes wide with feigned horror, his clothes artfully torn, and a shallow cut on his arm that he presented as evidence of a desperate fight for his life. He told a story of fire blood and savagery. A Cheyenne war party, he'd claimed, had descended on the homestead at dawn. He spoke of war paint and terrifying cries of being overwhelmed while he fought bravely to defend Martin Ferguson and his wife Clara. He alone had escaped hiding in a creek bed while the warriors burned the cabin and made off with the horses. The story spread through Dust Devil Creek like a prairie fire. Fear, a constant low-humming presence on the frontier, sharpened into a fine point of rage. These were people who lived with the daily threat of hardship, drought, blizzards, sickness. An Indian raid was their most primal fear made real. Sheriff Wallace Thorne listened to Kane's story in his office, his face a granite mask. Thorne was a tall, raw-boned man with a drooping mustache and eyes the color of a winter sky. He had been a lawman for 15 years, and he ruled his county with a rigid, uncompromising sense of justice. But his justice was not blind. It was scarred by the past. 20 years prior, his own family's wagon train had been attacked by a Sioux war party on the plains of Nebraska. He had been a boy of 14 and had survived by hiding under his mother's body. The memory had curdled inside him, turning his grief into a cold, abiding hatred for all tribes. He didn't question Silas Kane's story. He didn't need to. It confirmed everything he already believed, that the only good Indian was a dead one. The recent treaty signed at Fort Laramie was in his eyes a fool's pact, a temporary truce that the Cheyenne would break the first chance they got. This, he thought, was that chance. How many? Thorne asked, his voice a low growl. A dozen, maybe more, Kane said, his voice catching. They were on us before we could even grab our rifles. It was a massacre, Sheriff. Thorne's jaw tightened. Get Doc Abernathy out to the homestead. And you, he said, turning to his deputy, a young, impressionable man named Peterson. Start rounding up a posse. Every man with a horse and a rifle. Meet at the livery in 1 hour. Peterson scurried out, eager to carry out the order. The town was more than ready. Men poured out of the saloon, their earlier conversations about cattle prices and poker hands forgotten. They grabbed rifles from their homes, shotguns from behind store counters. Elias Vance, the owner of the livery stable, found his business suddenly booming as men demanded their best horses. The atmosphere on the street was thick with a volatile mix of fear and bloodlust. Augustus Gus Miller, the town blacksmith, stood in the doorway of his forge, the heat from the banked coals at his back. He was a powerfully built man, with a calm, thoughtful demeanor that was at odds with the frenzy gripping the town. He watched as men checked the cylinders of their Colts and filled their pockets with cartridges. He heard the talk, the boasts of what they would do when they caught the savages. It was an ugly sound. It's a bad business, Gus said, a voice beside him. It was Doc Abernathy, a man whose weary eyes had seen the end of more lives than anyone else in town. He was hitching his horse to a buggy, his medical bag already on the seat. It is, Gus agreed, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. A lot of angry men looking for someone to blame. Thorne's already made up his mind who that is. Abernathy said, his mouth a grim line. He's not looking for justice. He's looking for a reason to start a war. The doctor climbed into his buggy. I'm heading out to the Ferguson place now. Something about this stinks, Gus. Silas Kane is a two-bit liar and a cheat. Never trusted him. You be careful out there, Doc, Gus said. The only thing more dangerous than a guilty man is a righteous one with a gun. Doc Abernathy just nodded and flicked the reins, his buggy rattling down the street and out of town, a lone voice of skepticism heading toward a scene of supposed carnage. Back in his office, Sheriff Thorne unlocked a heavy wooden chest. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, was a Sharps rifle, the same kind used by the buffalo hunters. It was a weapon capable of killing at 1,000 yards. He took it out, its weight familiar and comforting in his hands. He also took out an old cavalry saber, its blade still sharp. It had belonged to his father. He strapped it to his belt, a piece of his personal history, now part of his public duty. When he stepped outside, the posse was already forming. It was a motley collection of townsfolk and ranch hands, their faces grim, their eyes shining with grim purpose. There were nearly 30 of them. Thorne climbed onto his horse, a big black stallion that matched his own somber demeanor. He looked out over the faces of the men who had put their trust in him. Men, he began his voice, carrying easily in the tense silence. The Ferguson family has been butchered in their home. Their homestead is a smouldering ruin. The Cheyenne have broken the treaty. They have brought their savagery to our doorstep. He paused, letting the words sink in. We will not stand for it. We ride today to show them that this land is ours. We will hunt down every last one of the warriors responsible, and we will deliver a justice so swift and so final that they will never again dare to threaten our homes, our wives, our children. A ragged cheer went up from the crowd. Thorne raised a hand for silence. They've run to the foothills, he declared, pointing toward the hazy blue mountains in the west. They think they can hide in the rocks and canyons. They are wrong. We will sweep those hills from top to bottom, spread out and search every draw, every cave, every inch of ground. I want the man who led this raid found. We'll bring him back to Dust Devil Creek and show everyone what happens to murderers. He spurred his horse, and the posse surged forward behind him, a wave of armed and angry men kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. They were a storm of retribution, a gathering force of hatred and grief, riding unknowingly toward a single hidden cabin where a man named Josiah Coulter was trying to save the life of the man they had already condemned. 2 days passed in the quiet valley. Under Josiah's care, Nakoa's fever began to break. The warrior remained weak, but the haze of delirium lifted from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, assessing intelligence. He spoke little, and Josiah didn't press him. An unspoken understanding existed between them, a fragile peace maintained by shared water food and the quiet ritual of cleaning and dressing the wound. Josiah learned his name, Nakoa, in a moment of clarity, when the warrior pointed to his own chest and spoke the word with quiet dignity. Josiah's supplies, however, were running low. He needed more linen for bandages, and more importantly, laudanum for the pain that still racked Nakoa's body. He had no choice but to go to town. I have to go to Dust Devil Creek, Josiah said, on the morning of the 3rd day. He was checking the dressing on Nakoa's leg. The swelling had gone down, and the angry red color was fading. I'll be back by nightfall. Nakoa's eyes narrowed. Town. He said the English word sounding foreign on his tongue. He then added a string of words in Cheyenne. Josiah shook his head. I don't understand. Nakoa pointed at his leg, then made a gesture like a man aiming a rifle. His meaning was clear. The men who had shot him were in that town. I know, Josiah said, his voice low. I'll be careful. No one knows you're here. He left a full canteen and a plate of cooked venison by the bed. He took his rifle and strapped a pistol to his hip, a precaution he hadn't felt the need for in years. As he stepped out of the cabin, he felt Nakoa's eyes on his back, a look of profound and unsettling distrust. The ride to Dust Devil Creek felt different. The air itself seemed charged with a nervous energy. As he approached, he saw 2 armed men posted as lookouts on a ridge overlooking the main road, a sign of a town on high alert. They watched him pass, their expressions hard and suspicious. He tied Boulder in front of the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk. The town was quieter than usual, but it was a tense, watchful quiet. The few people on the street stopped their conversations to stare at him. Josiah was a familiar stranger to them, the quiet trapper who kept to himself. Today their stares felt heavier, more probing. He went into the general store first. The proprietor, a nervous man named Henderson, was polishing the glass on his countertop with a frantic energy. Josiah, he said, his voice a little too loud. Haven't seen you in a while. Been busy, Josiah replied, his gaze sweeping the store. I need linen, a few tins of beans, and some coffee. Henderson gathered the items, his hands trembling slightly. Terrible business, isn't it? Just terrible. The Fergusons. Good people. Salt of the earth. What about the Fergusons? Josiah asked, keeping his tone even. Henderson's eyes widened. You haven't heard their place was raided. Cheyenne warriors. Burned it to the ground. Killed Martin and Clara. Only the hired hand, Silas Kane, made it out alive. A cold knot formed in Josiah's stomach. A raid. The timing was too close. Nakoa's wound was at least 4 or 5 days old. This raid had happened 2 days ago. It didn't add up. Sheriff Thorne took a posse out a couple days ago. Henderson continued lowering his voice, conspiratorially. They're sweeping the foothills now. Found a trail heading west. It's only a matter of time before they find them. Josiah paid for his goods, his mind racing. He needed more information. The best place for that was the saloon. He stowed his purchases in his saddlebags and pushed through the swinging doors of the Last Chance saloon. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer sweat and cigar smoke. A dozen men were scattered around the room, nursing drinks and talking in low, angry voices. At a corner table, Silas Kane was holding court. He looked less like a grieving survivor and more like a local hero. His arm was in a clean new sling, and a free bottle of whiskey sat in front of him. Came over the rise like demons out of hell. Kane was saying, his voice full of theatrical bravado. I got Martin's old Spencer rifle and dropped 2 of them before they even reached the porch. But there were too many. They were on us in a heartbeat. Josiah moved to the bar and ordered a beer he didn't want. He listened his back to the room as Kane spun his tale. The details grew more elaborate with each telling. The dozen warriors had become 20. His own bravery had grown exponentially. Sounds like you're lucky to be alive, said Elias Vance, the livery owner who was standing near Josiah at the bar. The Lord was watching over me, Kane said piously, taking a long pull from the whiskey bottle. Josiah turned from the bar. Where did you say this happened? The Ferguson place. Kane's eyes, small and shifty, landed on Josiah. That's right. 10 miles east of here. East, Josiah said, letting a hint of confusion enter his voice. That's odd. I was hunting out that way 3 days ago. Didn't see any sign of a war party. Quiet as a tomb out there. Kane's bravado faltered for a second. A flicker of anger crossed his face. Well, maybe you weren't looking in the right place. They move like snakes when they want to. Maybe Josiah conceded taking a sip of his beer. He looked at Kane's sling. That's a nasty cut. Must have been a war lance, it was Kane said, puffing out his chest. Came within an inch of my heart. From the doorway, a deep voice boomed. The cut looks more like you stumbled into a barbed wire fence. Silas. Gus Miller, the blacksmith, entered the saloon, wiping soot from his brow. He nodded a greeting to Josiah. Kane scowled. What would you know about it, Miller? I know you've been telling this story for 2 days, and every time you tell it you get braver, and the Cheyenne get more numerous. Gus said, his voice calm but carrying a clear challenge. He leaned against the bar next to Josiah. I also know that Martin Ferguson kept his life savings, nearly $500 from a cattle sale, in a cash box under his bed. Funny you didn't mention that being stolen. A tense silence fell over the saloon. Kane's face paled slightly. I didn't have time to look. I was running for my life. Of course, Gus said, his tone laced with sarcasm. He turned to Josiah. Good to see you, Coulter. Heard you were in town. His eyes held a question, a silent acknowledgement that both of them found something rotten in the story everyone else was so eager to swallow. Josiah just nodded, finishing his beer. He had heard enough. The story was a lie. The location was wrong. The timing was off, and the sole witness was a preening coward who was enjoying his newfound fame far too much. The posse, led by a man blinded by old hatreds, was hunting a ghost. But in their hunt, they were liable to kill the first real native they found, and Josiah knew exactly where to find him. He set his glass on the bar and walked out of the saloon, the whispers and suspicious stares following him into the unforgiving sunlight. He had to get to Doc Abernathy. Doc Abernathy's office was at the far end of town, a small, neat building that smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. A sign with his name, Dr. Alistair Abernathy, hung slightly askew from a post out front. Josiah found the doctor sitting at his desk, staring into a half-empty glass of brandy, though it was barely midday. The man looked exhausted, his face etched with a deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. "Coulter," he said, looking up as Josiah entered. He gestured to the empty chair opposite the desk. "Come for a checkup, or just to escape the madness?" "A little of both," Josiah said, taking the seat. "I need to buy some laudanum, and more bandages." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Laudanum? That's powerful stuff." "You ail in a hunting accident," Josiah lied smoothly. "Gored my leg on a broken branch. It's healing, but it aches something fierce at night." Abernathy studied him for a long moment, his intelligent eyes missing nothing. He seemed to debate whether to press the issue, then sighed and let it go. He got up and went to a tall wooden cabinet, unlocking it with a small key. "I trust you know how to use this sparingly." He poured a small amount into a dark blue bottle and wrapped it along with a thick roll of linen. As he worked, Josiah leaned forward. "I was just at the saloon, heard Silas Kane's story about the raid." Abernathy snorted his back, still to Josiah. "A story is exactly what it is, a work of fiction." He turned his face dark. "I was the one who went out to the Ferguson place, Josiah. I was the one who brought the bodies back." He sat down heavily and took a swallow of his brandy. "It was no Cheyenne raid. I've seen the results of those. They're brutal, bloody affairs. But this was different. Martin Ferguson was shot in the back with a pistol, a .44 caliber, by the look of the wound, from close range. His wife Clara, she was killed by a single blow to the head. The cabin wasn't burned in a frenzy. It was set on fire after the fact, a clumsy attempt to cover up the evidence. The horses weren't driven off by warriors. Their lead ropes were cut clean with a knife. Josiah's blood ran cold. "Did you tell Sheriff Thorne?" "Of course I told him." Abernathy snapped, his voice rising. "I told him everything. I told him the wounds were wrong. I told him the arrow they found conveniently sticking in the doorframe had trade post fletching and had been pushed in by hand, not fired from a bow. I told him Silas Kane's lance wound was a superficial cut that he likely inflicted on himself." And Josiah pressed, and he didn't want to hear it, the doctor said, his voice dropping to a bitter whisper. Thorne saw what he wanted to see. He saw painted faces and heard war cries because that's the world he lives in. He's been waiting for an excuse like this for years. He looked me straight in the eye and said my grief was making me see things. He told me to tend to the dead and let him tend to the law. The pieces clicked into place in Josiah's mind with sickening clarity. Silas Kane was no hero. He was a murderer. He and perhaps an associate had killed the Fergusons for their money, then concocted the story of a Cheyenne raid to cover their tracks. They had played on the town's deepest fears, knowing that a man like Thorne would be the perfect instrument to carry out their misdirection. The posse wasn't a force of justice. It was a lynch mob being sent on a wild goose chase, pointed in the direction of the nearest, most convenient scapegoat. And Nakoa was directly in their path. His wound, which had nothing to do with the Fergusons, was now the very thing that would condemn him. If the posse found an injured Cheyenne warrior hiding in the hills, they wouldn't ask questions. They would see him as proof of Kane's story, one of the raiders wounded in the heroic fight Kane had described. Thorne would parade his body back to town as a trophy, a symbol of frontier justice served. The posse, Josiah said, his voice urgent. Where are they now? Thorne split them into 3 groups yesterday. Abernathy replied, tracing a map on his dusty desk with his finger. One sweeping south along the creek, one heading north toward the Badlands. Thorne himself took the main group, the largest one, straight west into the canyons, directly toward your territory. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. The doctor didn't know the whole truth, but he was a smart man. He saw a reclusive trapper suddenly buying laudanum for a leg wound on the same day the town was hunting an Indian. He was putting the pieces together. Josiah stood up, his face grim. He placed the coins for the supplies on the desk. Thank you, Doc. Josiah, Abernathy said, his voice stopping him at the door. Whatever it is you're mixed up in, be careful. Thorne's not just hunting an enemy. He's hunting a ghost from his own past. A man like that is dangerous. He won't be reasoned with. I know, Josiah said, his hand on the door latch. But sometimes a man has to do what's right, not what's easy. The right thing and the foolish thing often look the same in this part of the world, the doctor warned. Josiah stepped out into the harsh afternoon light, his mind a whirlwind. The vague sense of trouble had sharpened into the certainty of impending disaster. He wasn't just hiding a man anymore. He was protecting an innocent victim from a state-sanctioned hanging. He untied Boulder, his movements quick and efficient. The sun was already beginning its long descent toward the jagged peaks of the mountains. He had to get back. He had to warn Nakoa. The race had begun. It was no longer a race against infection or fever. It was a race against the dawn and against the blind, deafening storm of Wallace Thorne's justice. The ride back to the cabin was a frantic, desperate affair. Josiah pushed Boulder harder than he ever had, before the horses' hooves churning up dust as they galloped through the familiar terrain. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the approach of riders. The words of Doc Abernathy echoed in his mind. Thorne took the main group, straight west into the canyons. He reached the hidden valley as dusk was settling the sky, a deep, bruised purple. He half-tumbled from the saddle, leaving Boulder panting and foam-flecked, and burst into the cabin. Nakoa was sitting up his back against the wall. He had been working the sinew binding on one of the eagle feathers, trying to repair it. He looked up, his expression guarded, as Josiah entered. The knife he kept close was in his hand. We have to go, Josiah said, breathless. Now. He didn't have the words in Cheyenne, and Nakoa's English was limited, but the urgency in his voice was a universal language. He quickly explained, using a mixture of simple English words and gestures. Posse, he said, making a shape of many riders with his hands. They hunt. They think you killed settlers. He pointed east, then made a gesture of a cabin burning, then pointed at Nakoa. They are wrong. But they come. They come here. Nakoa's eyes, which had been slowly regaining their life, hardened into obsidian chips. He understood perfectly. He had been tracked, shot, and left for dead. Now he was being hunted for a crime he did not commit. It was the old bitter story of his people. He pushed himself to a sitting position, his jaw tight against the pain, and nodded. He was a warrior. He would not be taken like a cornered animal. Panic was a useless luxury. Josiah forced himself into a state of cold, calculated efficiency. They could take little. He grabbed a sack and threw in the remaining jerky, a block of cheese, and a small pouch of ground coffee. He filled both his canteens from the water barrel. He took the new bottle of laudanum and the bandages from his saddlebag and stuffed them into the sack. "Can you ride?" he asked Nakoa. Nakoa gave a curt nod, though the grimace on his face betrayed the agony the thought caused him. Getting Nakoa onto Boulder was a slow, painful process. Every jostle sent a jolt of pain through his injured leg. Once he was in the saddle, he swayed, his face pale in the moonlight. Josiah swung up behind him, taking the reins and using his own body to steady the injured man. "We go north," Nakoa rasped, his voice rough. He pointed toward the most rugged, impassable part of the foothills, Shadow Canyon. Many caves. Hard to track, Josiah agreed. It was their only chance. Thorne's men would be sweeping the more obvious routes. Their only hope lay in the treacherous, broken country where a large group of horses couldn't easily go. He guided Boulder out of the valley, not back toward the main trail, but directly up the steep wooded slope behind the cabin. The horse struggled its iron-shod hooves, slipping on the loose scree. Branches clawed at them, and the darkness was absolute under the thick canopy of pines. Josiah relied on instinct and his intimate knowledge of the land, navigating by the feel of the ground and the faint outline of the ridgeline against the star-dusted sky. Nakoa, despite his pain, was an asset. He was a part of this land in a way Josiah, for all his years as a trapper, could never be. He would point, his gesture economical but precise, indicating a hidden game trail, a safer passage through a rock fall, a place where the creek was shallow enough to cross without leaving a clear trail. They were a strange pair, the white trapper who had turned his back on his own world, and the Cheyenne warrior who was being hunted by it, working together in a desperate symbiosis. Hours crept by. The moon climbed high, casting long skeletal shadows across the landscape. They moved in silence, the only sounds the horse's labored breathing and the crunch of its hooves on stone. The cold night air bit at their skin. Sometime after midnight, as they were traversing a high, exposed ridge, Nakoa suddenly stiffened. He grabbed Josiah's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen," he whispered. Josiah reined in Boulder, his own senses straining. At first he heard nothing but the wind sighing through the pines. Then he caught it, a faint, rhythmic clinking. Metal on rock, the sound of a shod horse somewhere below them in the darkness. He slid from Boulder's back, handing the reins to Nakoa. He crept to the edge of the ridge and peered down. In the valley below, a single campfire flickered like a dying ember. 3 figures were huddled around it. An advance scout party from the Posse sent ahead to cover the high ground. They were camped less than half a mile away, directly in the path Nakoa had suggested. Josiah's heart pounded against his ribs. They had been so close to stumbling right into them. He scrambled back to the horse. "Scouts," he whispered, 3 of them, blocking the way to the canyon. Nakoa's face was a grim mask in the moonlight. He considered their options. To go back was impossible. To go around would take too long. The main body of the posse would be on them by sunrise. That left only one choice. He pointed again, not toward the trail, but down the steepest, most treacherous part of the ridge, a chaotic jumble of boulders and scree that looked impassable even on foot. "There," he said. The single word carried the weight of a terrible gamble. Josiah hesitated for only a second. It was madness. A single misstep would send the horse and them tumbling to their deaths. But looking at the calm, resolute expression on Nakoa's face, he knew it was their only path. He trusted the warrior's knowledge. He took the reins and began to lead the horse down the slope. It was less a ride and more a controlled fall. Boulder, sensing the danger, trembled and fought the reins, but Josiah soothed him with a low voice, forcing him onward. Rocks dislodged by their passage skittered down into the darkness. the sound deafeningly loud in the stillness. Josiah froze after each one, listening, waiting for a shout from the camp below. But none came. The wind carried the sound away. The descent took nearly an hour, a nerve-shredding ordeal that left all three of them, man, and horse, drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion. When they finally reached the valley floor, they were a mile past the posse's camp. They had made it. They pressed on, pushing deeper into the labyrinthine wilderness. The sky in the east was beginning to soften from black to a deep indigo. The dawn was coming, and with it Sheriff Thorne and the rest of the hunters. They had won the race against the night, but the race against the dawn had just begun. Shadow Canyon was close now, but so were their pursuers. Dawn broke over the Wind River Range with a harsh, revealing light. Josiah and Nakoa were cornered at the mouth of Shadow Canyon, a deep scar in the earth. Their horse Boulder was lame and could go no further. Exhausted and out of options, they took cover in a shallow alcove screened by stunted junipers. Nakoa, accepting his fate, pulled the knife from his belt. His face was serene as he began a soft, guttural chant, a prayer to prepare his soul for the end. Josiah watched him, his heart heavy. He hadn't come this far just to watch an innocent man die in a pointless gunfight. He didn't have long to think. A shout echoed from the canyon mouth. "Over here, a horse!" Its coulter's buckskin footsteps crunched on the gravel. Sheriff Wallace Thorne appeared, his Sharps rifle held at the ready, followed by a dozen men from the posse who fanned out behind him, their faces grim with anticipation. Coulter Thorne's voice boomed, bouncing off the canyon walls. "I know you're in there. Come on out. You're harboring a murderer." Josiah took a deep breath. "He's no murderer. Thorne Silas Kane is the killer. I've heard enough of your lies." Thorne roared, his patience gone. He raised his rifle. "Send out the Cheyenne, or we're coming in, shooting." The posse members raised their weapons' hammers, clicking back with an ominous finality. Just as Thorne was about to give the order, the thunder of approaching horses interrupted the standoff. Two riders galloped into the canyon, mouth silhouetted against the rising sun. It was Doc Abernathy and Gus Miller. "Thorne, wait," the blacksmith yelled, his powerful voice cutting through the tension. He reined in his heaving horse and dismounted, holding up a metal cash box. "You're about to make a terrible mistake." Thorne stared, his face a mask of fury. "What is this, Miller? Get out of my way." "Not until you hear the truth," Gus said, striding forward. "We found this in Silas Kane's room, above the saloon. It's Martin Ferguson's cash box." Doc Abernathy joined him, his face stern. "We also found his shirt, Wallace. It had powder burns on the sleeve. Kane wasn't fighting off a war party. He was standing over Martin Ferguson when he shot him in the back. He invented the raid to cover his own crime." The words struck the posse like a physical blow. A wave of confusion and doubt washed over the men's faces. They looked from the cash box to their sheriff, their certainty crumbling into shame. Sheriff Thorne stared at the evidence, his mind refusing to accept it. His righteous crusade, fueled by 20 years of old hatred, had been exposed as a lie. The fire in his eyes guttered, replaced by a hollow, sickening emptiness. Slowly he lowered the barrel of his Sharps rifle. Seeing their leader's resolve shatter, the other men hesitantly did the same. The standoff was over. From the alcove Josiah watched, as Nakoa gave him a single profound nod, a silent acknowledgement of a life debt paid. Then, as quiet as a shadow, he slipped out of the back of the alcove and vanished into the canyon's depths. The posse dissolved in a murmur of confusion, mounting their horses and riding away, leaving Thorne standing alone in the canyon, a man defeated by his own prejudice. Josiah stepped out into the morning light as Gus and Doc Abernathy rode over. You took a hell of a risk, Josiah. Gus said, his voice filled with a deep respect. Some things are worth the risk, Josiah replied, his gaze turning to the empty wilderness where Nakua had disappeared. He knew he could no longer live his quiet life. He would forever be the man who sided with an Indian against his own kind. But as he went to retrieve his weary horse, he felt no regret. He had faced the echoes of his past, and this time had not faltered. Josiah Coulter stood alone as the dust settled a hero to no one but his own conscience. He had saved a life, but shattered his own peace, proving that true courage isn't found in the thunder of a gunfight, but in the quiet, defiant act of seeing a man instead of an enemy. The West was a land of brutal simplicity, but its stories are woven with complex threads of justice, prejudice, and the debts we owe to our fellow human beings. What would you have done in his place if this story of moral grit and high-stakes drama resonated with you? Please leave a like, share it with someone who loves a true Western, and subscribe for more tales from the untamed frontier. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.